episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Okay, welcome everybody again to another episode of our show with another truly fascinating guest who is involved in creating a better tomorrow for all of us. We are honored today to be joined by Dr. David Fajgenbaum, Assistant Professor of Medicine and Translational Medicine and Human Genetics at the University of Pennsylvania, Associate Director, Patient Impact of the Penn Orphan Disease Center, Founding Director of the Center for Cytokine Storm Treatment and Laboratory, and co-founder of the Executive Director of the Castleman Disease Collaborative Network. He's also the national best-selling author of Chasing My Cure, A Doctor's Race to Turn Hope into Action. Dr. Fajgenbaum leads 18 translational research studies, including the first ever NIH R01-funded research into idiopathic multicentric Castleman's disease, which is a deadly condition that he also battles as a patient. He's in his longest remission ever thanks to a precision treatment that he himself identified, which has never been used before for Castleman's disease, and has published research in high-impact journals, including Blood, Lancet Haematology, and the Journal of Clinical Investigation, including one paper selected by Stat News in 2020 as the best innovations in science and medicine. Dr. Fajgenbaum co-founded the Castleman Disease Collaborative Network in 2012 to help accelerate research into treatments for Castleman's disease through a collaborative network approach, which is a business-inspired approach to biomedical research, which has become a blueprint for advancing rare disease research. His work has been highlighted in multiple news sources around the world. He has received numerous awards for it. He earned his MD at the Raymond and Ruth Perelman School of Medicine at University of Pennsylvania, where he was a 21st Century Gamble Scholar. He studied for his master's in public health at Oxford. His Bachelor of Science was in distinction from Georgetown, where he was also academic USA first team quarterback on the Division I football team. He also received his MBA from University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School. Dr. David Fajgenbaum, thank you for taking the time to come on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be back on.
Absolutely. It's good seeing you again. So much has happened since we last had the opportunity to chat, but as we typically do, I'd love to just pass you the floor for a few minutes just to reintroduce yourself to this audience, and if you could take us back, obviously, to the early days of everything about where you grew up, a little of your early background, and if you could take us into sort of 2010 when you were initially diagnosed with Castleman's disease. I think that'll be a great way to lay the ground for everything we're going to be talking about.
Sure. So I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, had two amazing parents that supported me through my journey there. Actually, I'm a first generation American. They both immigrated to the United States from Trinidad, a small island of the Caribbean. And for me, growing up, football was my passion, and all I could imagine was and think about was one day playing college football. That's all I ever dreamed of. And my parents supported me in that dream. I eventually had the opportunity to go to Georgetown to play football. Of course, we're not known for our football at Georgetown, but we are Division I, and we play Ivy League schools and Patriot League schools. But it was that was really a lifelong dream, which, like I said, I received so much support from my dad, my mom, and my sisters. And I finally got there, and here I am at Georgetown, living this dream that I'd had for so long. And out of nowhere, my life just suddenly changed when I found out that my mom was diagnosed with brain cancer. So just a few weeks after I got to Georgetown, she was diagnosed with this really awful form of cancer, and we knew right away that it was terminal. And all of a sudden, my life, in one way, it was shattered. My heart was shattered, but in another way, my life just completely changed in the sense that I went from having this passion of one day playing college football. Here I was, playing college football to really dreaming of one day taking care of patients like my mom and being a part of finding treatments to save the lives of people like my mom. And so I stayed at Georgetown, and I traveled back and forth nearly every weekend to see my mom for my first year and a half of college. And unfortunately, she passed away halfway through my sophomore year. And it was just such a devastating experience to lose her. And as I said earlier, her illness and then her passing really just completely altered my life course. And so I really doubled down on my pre-med classes, and then I knew I wanted to go to medical school one day. As you mentioned, I ended up going to graduate school at Oxford because I wanted to study cancer prevention. How do you prevent this awful thing from happening in the first place? But then I was back at Penn, and here I was again, now a third-year medical student, kind of achieving that dream that I set out for when my mom passed away, of going into medicine, being a scientist, finding treatments and cures. When out of nowhere, my life was completely altered again when I personally became critically ill in the intensive care unit. My liver, my kidneys, my bone marrow, my heart, and my lungs just started to shut down for no known cause. And so I was hospitalized, sent to the ICU. I had a retinal hemorrhage that made me blind in my left eye, gained 70 pounds of fluid, spent most of the time unconscious. And all of this time, we had no idea what the disease was. We didn't know what it was that was killing me. I was actually so sick at one point that I had my last rites read to me because the doctors were sure that I wasn't going to survive. And so I really consider that moment to be the start of my overtime, which certainly when we think about overtime, there's obviously the connections back to the college football days, but it's extra time that you didn't think you'd have where you really have to make the most of it. Thankfully, right around the time I had my last rites read to me, the diagnosis was finally made of idiopathic multicentric Castleman disease. And with the diagnosis came treatment. And I started being treated with chemotherapy, which thankfully saved my life. But unfortunately, I would go on to have relapse after relapse after relapse.
And you know, when I originally was reading about, you know, this part of your journey, you know, you've described this form of Castleman's disease as sort of I would say the perfect storm of autoimmune, or the worst autoimmune disease and cancer, all in one. And you know, you mentioned the hemorrhaging of your retina. You know, at the time they didn't know if you had some form of lymphoma or lupus, but there was your whole system went haywire. And you know, as we got into 2020 and this COVID situation came upon us, and this term cytokine storm was introduced to not just the American public, the global public, as this out of control immune system where everything, as you were just saying, Castleman's, is going wrong and everything's shutting down. I'm sitting there thinking, my God, this is what Dr. Fajgenbaum was talking about last year. I mean, this is the exact same thing, but he was experiencing it. Could you just talk a little bit about how your experiences with Castleman's and this bizarre set of, you know, components of this disease has now affected your thinking? We'll go into a little what you're doing on the COVID front in a little while, but between what's happening in the world today with COVID obviously trickled down to cytokine storms, immune system running wild, and what you experienced, talk a little bit some of those parallels.
Sure. So you're exactly right. What I was experiencing and what I have experienced 5 times is called a cytokine storm, where basically your immune system turns on and starts attacking vital organs for an unknown cause. And so a cytokine storm, it actually had never really been defined, but it's basically a term that many of us use to describe, when the immune system's out of control. And it's actually, you know, the immune system is supposed to be there to protect you. And so, you know, if you get a cold or COVID, it's there to fight off that infection. But sometimes in the midst of either fighting off an infection or sometimes for no reason at all, it just goes into overdrive and actually causes more harm than good. And so that's exactly what happens with COVID. And we started learning early on that people were having this incredible immune response. I mean, you hear about some people that are asymptomatic. They get infected with SARS-CoV-2. Their immune system controls it so well that they don't even feel a symptom. Whereas there's other people who get infected with the exact same virus, the same amount of the exact same virus. They end up in the intensive care unit. And it's not because that virus was necessarily causing more harm, the virus. It was actually that it was the immune system's attempt to control the virus that was causing harm. And so this concept of a cytokine storm is something that we've been thinking about for a long time. In fact, I run a center called the Center for Cytokine Storm Treatment and Laboratory. And for so long, you know, people would say, what is a cytokine storm? And unfortunately, you know, the whole world now knows what it is. And even more unfortunately, many patients have experienced a similar cytokine storm. And so thankfully, the years and years of work that we did and others have done to understand why is it that the immune system gets out of control and how do we better control it, those insights are now being able to be applied to COVID.
And as you, following your diagnosis, and you mentioned you were treated with chemotherapy drugs, high-dose steroids, I believe, as well, other therapies. You ultimately, as you started exploring via your personal research, you ultimately landed on a drug called rapamycin, which we talked a little bit about the show in the past and in different contexts, a macrolide substance normally used to treat organ transplant. Worked very well for you and was a very interesting case of what we discussed too in the past of repurposing, the concept that we have tens of thousands of pharmacologically active substances already approved by the FDA on the market. We know they do certain things in terms of a mechanism, but chemistry is very unique. It's a very, let's say, a large chemical universe out there for how one substance, just like an aspirin, can thin your blood, but also help your headache and so forth. Talk a little bit, if you would, about some of your research in repurposing, not just obviously in Castleman's, but you have now taken this knowledge and this expertise and are applying it to COVID.
Yeah. So you can imagine someone like me who's alive today. We're talking today because of a drug that was developed for a completely different disease that no one had ever thought about. It was at my neighborhood pharmacy every time I walked past that pharmacy for all those years when I was in and out of the hospital. And I'm alive today because if you can imagine someone like me feels this incredible sense of needing to kind of spread the wealth, like, share this message and hopefully increase the amount of drug repurposing. Because if we hadn't done the work to find out that sirolimus might help me, I wouldn't be benefiting from it. Other Castleman's patients wouldn't be benefiting from it. And so it makes someone like me say, well, how many other drugs are there out there, like you said, that are just sitting in a pharmacy that they're helping in one condition we know about, but there may be many other conditions that we don't even know how else they could be helpful, many other diseases that could benefit from those same drugs. So this concept of drug repurposing is something that has been top of mind for me for a long time. I've been engaged with the FDA around discussions on this topic for several years. The FDA's job is to determine when a drug is safe and effective for one disease at a time. And the only time they review a drug for another disease is when that company goes to them and says, hey, will you decide if this drug should be approved for another disease? And so I've spent a lot of time talking to them and saying, can we think about ways to be a bit more proactive rather than waiting and hoping that some company figures out another use for their drug and then spends the money to actually take the time to share the data with you. Why don't we think a bit more about, okay, you're the FDA, you've approved thousands of drugs. Let's be more proactive and think about how else they could be used. And so I'm really honored and thankful. I'm now co-directing an initiative called the Cure Drug Repurposing Collaboratory, which is a partnership between the FDA, the NIH, and a group called the Critical Path Institute. And between those three players, myself and others, our goal is to try to make drug repurposing happen more automatically. And we don't have to wait for some medical student to get sick with some awful disease for a drug to have a new use. So we're doing that with the FDA, and I'm really excited to work with Heather Stone, Leonard Sachs from FDA, who are really leading this. But in addition to this kind of general effort, as you mentioned, we have been trying to put this principle into practice for COVID. And so we run a project called the Corona Project. It's specifically around tracking all of these uses of different drugs. I mean, there've literally been hundreds of drugs that have been tried to treat COVID, but there was never a database, and there aren't databases for nearly every disease out there of what's being tried, what looks promising, what doesn't look promising.
And continuing along those lines, obviously, as you mentioned, rapamycin, a potent immunosuppressant originally developed for organ transplant. You found, obviously, the uses in Castleman's. It is also a drug that has, effect that we might not normally think of and is being studied. I talked to somebody that's actually studying it in dogs for aging and sort of slowing down the aging process. So we don't normally think of those things, immunosuppressant and aging. Obviously, nothing confidential, but are you running into any interesting leads or hits in your COVID research? Because I know you've looked at a lot of different cases and so forth of things that are bizarre in the sense that it doesn't seem to make sense, but it's working. Or anything you could talk about there?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I think about our COVID work, I mentioned that there have been hundreds of drugs. We've actually found over 400 different drugs have been given to COVID patients already. I mean, and it's actually probably even more that have been given in trials that just haven't reported out their results yet. So we're talking hundreds of different drugs have been tried. And just as you said, mixed within those hundreds of drugs are drugs that no one would have thought of trying, but there was a drug screen done where you basically put a bunch of cells in a dish, infect them with SARS-CoV-2, and then seed to any drugs prevent replication of the virus. And so there are drugs. There's actually an OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder drug that looks really promising. Wow. It's called fluvoxamine. I kind of had to like reread the paper a couple of times and be like, is this really, an OCD drug, going to be helpful against a virus? And as you said earlier, drugs can do mysterious things. It works on one thing in one way and another thing in another way. And so I think that's probably the most, maybe the one that I was least expecting is, an OCD drug. But there are also a lot of drugs that, one might expect to work that are looking promising. When I think about treating COVID, we hear about COVID therapeutics a lot, but they're actually, I think it's important to break them down into different categories. So there are what are called direct antivirals, where they're actually good at preventing the replication of the virus in your body. So they directly make it so that the virus doesn't do well in the host. That's number one. And that's the thing I think that most people think about when they think about SARS-CoV-2 treatments. But as we mentioned earlier, a cytokine storm is a big part of the most deadly cases of COVID. And so it's not just worrying about the virus. You have to worry about how do you appropriately either suppress or boost the immune response. And so another class of drugs that's really important are immunosuppressants, drugs that are given to patients that are very sick in the ICU, where they have a cytokine storm. You need to suppress the immune response. It's actually the immune response causing harm. Those are drugs like dexamethasone, baricitinib, actually drugs developed for Castleman disease like tocilizumab. These drugs are very good at suppressing. So immunosuppressants are in a category in addition to direct antivirals. But there's also some patients who will have too weak of an immune response, especially early on in the 5 days before you start presenting symptoms. Part of the reason you're not presenting symptoms is that the virus is doing a pretty good job evading your immune response. So if you can boost or improve the accuracy of your immune response early on, then you're more likely to control the virus and not have a cytokine storm later on. So these are immune stimulants, drugs like inhaled interferon, where you inhale a cytokine into your lungs, and that cytokine will boost the immune response where it needs to be and not everywhere else. And then there are immune replacements. So things you hear about, these monoclonal antibodies like Eli Lilly and Regeneron make, where you're actually replacing a function of the immune system. You're just giving someone a boatload of antibodies because their immune system didn't make it in the first place. So these are immune replacements. Convalescent plasma is another example of immune replacements. And the final category I like to think about are drugs focused on the sequelae of having COVID-19, so antithrombotics, because we know that if you have a bad COVID episode, you can have thromboses. So you take antithrombotics to prevent that. So it's not actually treating the virus, it's not treating the immune response, it's treating the kind of the byproducts of the viral immune response together. And so I think it's really important to think about drugs into those different categories. Fluvoxamine is thought to be a direct antiviral, by the way.
Interesting. Fascinating. You mentioned your work with this new organization in terms of repurposing the FDA. I was just interested because last time we talked a little bit about the Rare Disease Act and the sort of defining what constitutes a rare disease, the Global Genes organization, which I know you are associated with as well, estimates somewhere around 7,000 rare diseases per this United States definition. Any interesting things going on in terms of legislation, regulations, and so forth, beneficial to sort of this rare or orphan disease domain that are interesting that have happened in the last year that you want to talk about?
I wish there were more. I have to say that in the last year, there's been such a hyper focus, I think appropriately so in many ways, but such a hyper focus on SARS-CoV-2 that many rare diseases have certainly kind of fallen into the back burner, and also rare disease advocacy in general, I think has. But like you said, when you hear rare disease, you think, oh, well, by definition, if it's rare, then maybe there's not that many people, which is true on a per disease basis. But when you combine them all together, there are about 30 million Americans. So 1 in 10 Americans has a rare disease. Rare individually, but collectively a huge number. And I wish that there was more progress, and I'm hopeful there will be more progress in the future. What I really hope is that these drugs that are already approved for one condition, and most drugs that are already approved for something actually are already generic, because the FDA has been around
Sure.
for a long time. So there's a lot of generic drugs, and there is absolutely zero incentive whatsoever from pharmaceutical companies that make those generic drugs to try to figure out new uses for those drugs. And so I'm really hopeful that there can either be an effort through legislation or cooperation among pharmaceutical companies to try to look at all of these old drugs and to see how else they might be able to be used and figure out some way to incentivize it. Because right now there is no incentive. And I think, as you can imagine, the current political climate, no one wants to provide any sort of financial incentive to pharmaceutical companies. I think that years at different times in history, there's been more and less sort of appreciation, and pharma has been in different lights. I think right now, maybe it's in a better light because of, obviously the incredible innovation with COVID, but I think politically, no one really wants to give a big incentive to a company to develop new drugs. And what's hard about that is that patients suffer because of it, because of our political inclination to not want to incentivize drug companies going after new indications. That means, and a new indication just means a new disease. Well, there's a lot of people with those diseases that aren't going to benefit because we're not putting the incentives in place. And so I think we really need to figure that out.
Not to come to a slightly dark topic, but every year around this world, we lose around 65 million people, and death is everywhere, unfortunately, coming for all of us. But in the last year, of course, it's been in all of our faces, and it's touched a home to many. You, as you said, you've experienced not one time, but multiple times living, as you say, on overtime. Yep. You wrote a very nice piece recently entitled 5 Life Lessons from Chasing My Cure That We Need in This Time of COVID-19. Could you take a little time to go through some of your personal learnings and what you can impart to others in this really rough time?
Sure. So I think during really difficult times, I like to look back on how I kind of got through them, and some of the pearls from that. As you mentioned earlier, I shared a lot of these details in Chasing My Cure because I felt like I needed to share them. They helped me. I made it to the other side. I certainly am still fighting, and who knows when Castleman's will come back for me. But I do feel like there's things that helped me that I needed to get out to the world. And so one of those things is that during really difficult times, you need to lean on the people that you love. And so your family, your friends, for me, when I was in ICU, each of those times, having my dad, my sisters, my girlfriend at the time, Caitlin, having them physically present with me, and just being there, just showing up, was so important. I think COVID is particularly difficult because when our loved ones are in the hospital, we can't be there a lot of the times because of concerns about infectivity. And so, as much as is possible, being there with the people we love, maybe it's through Zoom or FaceTime, but being there, I think is critical. The second is that during really difficult times, I think it's important to look to the future, that which you're hoping for. So I think all of us are looking towards a future where there is no COVID, where we're able to be with the people we love, but envisioning what that thing is that you're working towards and you're hoping for, I think can be really helpful. But then I think once you think about what is it that you're hoping for, the next step for me, at least, was then saying, well, what can I do today to get me closer to the thing that I'm hoping for? Now, many of us feel like the COVID pandemic is out of our hands. And for the most part, for a lot of it, it is out of our hands, right? It's how quickly vaccines can be administered, who's going to take them, treatments. But there are things that we can do, right? We can socially distance, we can practice hand washing, we can, make a decision that's our own decision, and the right, whatever the right decision is for us about whether we get vaccinated or not. And so there are things we can do. And so I think that it's important to to say, okay, this is the vision I'm working towards. What can I do today to get towards that? And making sure that it's a cliche, I think, because it's true, and that's one day at a time. I think that sometimes you can get lost in saying like, oh my gosh, is this going to be over in 2021? I mean, I can't even fathom this continuing through December. I mean, that's like hard to wrap our heads around. And I think we all hope it won't, but if we can, have a vision for the future and then say, what can I do today to get closer to that, and really focus on today? I think those are some really critical tips that, at least for me, helped me out so much when I was in ICU.
David, obviously you mentioned your family a lot during our discussion. Obviously, the passing of your mother had a major impact on who you've become. Your wife, Caitlin, is obviously an awesome partner as you go through this process. Other people that you might want to mention, shout out to, whether in the Penn ecosystem, University City, or beyond, throughout your career, that have been really instrumental in keeping you on this path.
There are a lot of people. The first few, and this is not going to be comprehensive because we don't have enough time for me to give a comprehensive list. But maybe even before I get into the individuals, I think I'm really glad you asked this question, because it's such an important point, and I think that it's something that can be lost. My book is called Chasing My Cure, and so you might say, oh, it's someone who chased his cure. But no, it was chasing our cure, and it was really a team effort. So I'm glad you asked that, because I think it's really important. So the first person I mentioned is Arthur Rubenstein. He was the former dean of the medical school at Penn, and he retired right around the time that I happened to become ill. And in his retirement, he basically has agreed and offered and been incredible in providing time and support and energy towards thinking through, how do we take on Castleman disease? And now more recently, how do we turn our attention towards COVID? And so having someone like him with the kind of leadership experience and thoughtfulness that he has from decades of work in this realm has been instrumental for me in being able to anticipate challenges before they arise, and to kind of plan accordingly to prevent roadblocks from coming up that I would have never foreseen. But Arthur has been such a wonderful advisor. We met for the first time, I guess it was back in 2011. And since then, we've probably spoken on the phone or in person before COVID every couple of weeks since 2011. And I just, so fortunate to have his support. I also mentioned a few members of my team who've just been incredible and gone above and beyond. Sheila Pearson leads clinical research for our Center for Cytokine Storm Treatment and Laboratory. And the way that she's been able to basically both wrangle data, but then turn those large data sets into insights has been really, really incredible. And she's just been instrumental to the progress. And Johnson Core, Alexis Phillips are two members of our team who have made Corona kind of their life's work and their nights and weekends, in addition to the Castleman's work that they do. So these are just a few of the many. And as you're hearing this, you can tell that there's, as you said, people like my wife, Caitlin, so family, like my dad, but then there's also colleagues and mentors. There's really been this, in my opinion, I'm so fortunate to have had such a supportive sort of environment around me to be able to make the progress we have.
Wonderful. It's always very inspiring talking to you, Dave, and I really wishing you the best in all these projects and everything you're pushing forward. It's such an amazing portfolio. And as I said, really wishing you the best with this. For everybody that's going to be watching this particular episode or listening on the podcast, you've been listening to Dr. David Fajgenbaum, Assistant Professor of Medicine and Translational Medicine and Human Genetics at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also the Associate Director of the Patient Impact of the Penn Orphan Disease Center, the Founding Director of the Center for Cytokine Storm Treatment and Laboratory, and co-founder and Executive Director of the Castleman Disease Collaborative Network. Pick up his best-selling book, Chasing My Cure, A Doctor's Race to Turn Hope into Action. David, thank you once again for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to talk with us, and thank you for everything you're doing. And as we say, thank you for helping to create a better tomorrow through all your work. It's been a really wonderful and inspiring discussion.
Thanks so much, Ira. It's always wonderful to chat with you, and I so appreciate you helping to spread the word about Chasing My Cure, our message of hope, and the work that we're doing for COVID. Thanks so much.
It's wonderful.